everybody, welcome to my channel. Today we are going to make 2 cards with 1 napkin, but we're going to showcase 2 different watercolor techniques using Inktense blocks. I'm working on Strathmore watercolor cards. They're 5x7. I've taped it down onto the foam cord and I've marked where the top fold is so I don't lose track. I'm going to be using this Peace Nativity napkin. It's a cocktail sized napkin and it's just the right size for these cards. I rough cut it out, and as you can see, 1 napkin is going to give you 4 different images to use. So you can make 4 cards out of 1 napkin. I wet my fingers and I'm removing the excess 2 plies. Now, because this cocktail napkin, the size of it, or the 1/4 of it, is smaller than the card, I want to remove all the background. I want to isolate just the main focal image. And to do that, I'm using my liner brush and I am water cutting. So I'm running my brush with a very little bit of water and then just peeling off the excess. Just isolating the main image. This will allow me to make a background that is the full size of whatever substrate I'm working on. In my case, 5x7 card. It also allows me to change up the background colors should I want to do that. I'm getting as close as I can, and it's pretty easy with this image. We're dealing with a lot of straight edges or straw where it's pretty forgiving. And as you can see, we have some left over. We're going to have room to add some background as well. So now I'm going to use the Inktense blocks. Now I'm using Inktense instead of watercolor because Inktense blocks are permanent when dry. So I'm looking at the yellows that are in the napkin and the teals that are there, and I'm undecided about what color I want to use for the background. So I decide not to decide. I'm going to do 1 of each, showcasing a different watercolor technique. So I'm spraying the water onto the watercolor card, and this one is going to use the salt technique. So on this one I am putting the yellow. So I've matched it as close as I can by comparing it to the swatched colors that I have with my Inktense blocks. And I'm just dropping the color in, rubbing it on the brush, dropping the color in. Then I'm grabbing a slightly darker shade and just dropping that in and letting the magic happen with watercolor. This is the benefit of watercolor. It falls in and it moves a little bit with the water, creating its own pattern and design and effect. And this is coarse salt and I'm dropping it on top. Now what the salt does is absorb the liquid around it. And once dry, it's going to leave a pattern on the background. So I set that aside to dry and I'm working on the background of the other one. And this one we're going to use the plastic wrap technique. I'm using some of the teals. So I'm using some of the teals and green and I'm just dropping in the color like the first one. This is pretty easy. There's nothing too difficult about dropping it in and letting the water move it around. So this is a great way of doing multiple backgrounds very, very quickly. And if I was just doing a lot of cards, I would tape down all of them onto the different foam cores. I have about 6 or 8 of the foam core. Would tape them down and I would do all the watercolor. Now I decided to add some of that yellow into the background and I'm just dropping it in. I don't want to mix it all up. I want some areas to look a little bit more yellow or turn green where the yellow and the teal have worked together. Now I'm taking a piece of saran wrap, covering it up and then squooshing it in. And you can see you get kind of that broken glass look. Now you're going to want to set this aside and let it dry. That's why it's important to go work on something else. Now with the salt technique, you can speed up drying using your heat tool, but let the salt cool before you rub it off. And I'm just very gently rubbing it off once it's completely dry. And you can see the patterning that is left by the salt technique. Now that I have the beginnings of my background, I'm just putting down my focal image and seeing what I want to add to it. I decide that I want to add more patterning to my background. So I grab my Inktense block and a stamp. Now this has Old English letters and I'm stamping with it. Now you're going to notice I'm not getting anything too specific and I don't want to make it perfectly clear. I want to grunge up that background, add some patterning. I'm adding a little bit of water, making it move, and we're just really turning this background more into a kind of a rustic kind of look. And here I'm using a slightly darker yellow than what I did put originally. So it's kind of tone on tone. And I keep bringing in my focal image and I notice that there's some brown on that stable. And I want to introduce that to my background. So I grab another stamp. This one is a script stamp. And I'm grabbing an Inktense block that's brown. And I'm going to spray it lightly with water, rub the block along it, and stamp with it. So you can see how versatile these Inktense blocks are. I'll link the Inktense blocks, the Strathmore cards, in the description box below in my Amazon store, if you're interested in checking them out. So once that's completely dry, I am going to take some white gesso and white out the area right behind where I'm going to glue the napkin down. Now my background here is pretty light, but I don't want any color from that to distort the lights that are in the napkin. I want that bright white to show up. And I decide here that I'm going to cut off even more of the napkin. And sometimes when you get to the final stages of composition, you're going to want to do that, because now you have a better idea of how everything's going to work together. So I'm just adding a couple layers of gesso just to white out that background and then giving it a dry with the heat tool. Excuse me. Once everything's dry, I'm going to use my fluid matte medium and glue the napkin down. And I put a coat of the fluid matte medium on the top. That seals it. And make sure that it's perfectly adhered to the card. Because I had cut some of that napkin off, I now have a gap and I just grab my Inktense blocks and add it in. I'm also using the Inktense blocks and a combination of acrylic paints to overpaint on top of the napkin. This is giving a very painterly effect. You can skip this step if you want. I just always like to highlight certain parts of it and make it look less like I've glued a napkin down and more like I've hand painted it. So I'm doing the straw at the top, and then I'm adding some whites on the lighter spots just to brighten up those parts and draw your attention to them on the focal image. Here I'm adding the whites in. I'm putting white up there in the straw, then some brown, then some Naples yellow. And I just keep layering it up with my liner brush, thinning the paint as I go. I'm just colorizing the wood of the stable just to bring out the colors. Adding some straw at the bottom just to make everything fit in, blend with the background. And then, as so often the case, I want to splatter it with gold. I'm using the Inktense Blocks in the teal just to darken those areas. That serves to brighten the lighter areas. So I'm just tweaking the colors that are there and making it more my own. I'm using some shimmery goodness to give the halo and for the dove, and a few more gold splatters. I decide I want some music notes in the background because I'm going to put the caption Silent Night. But if I was doing this again, I would just do the music and skip the script one earlier on. I am stopping in between to make sure that everything is dry before I go on. Now I'm shading around the edge using some brown acrylic paint and my angle brush. Having the straight edge of the tape there really makes this a very easy process. I dig out my wooden blocks and I'm stamping in brown acrylic paint, cleaning off each stamp as I go. I'm not trying to make the letters all perfectly level. Because I never do. I like it kind of wonky letters. It adds to the rustic feel of the card. Now this tape, depending on how long you have it, it may lift up some of the paper. To avoid that, if you use your heat tool and heat it up slightly, it loosens the glue and you're less likely to rip any of the tape off the paper off the card. Just a little trick. And there's card 1, and actually I really like it. So let's work on card 2. Now I made a mask with some of the excess ply of napkin, and then I'm stenciling using the sheet music stencil and gold paint on a blending foam, Ranger's blending foam, and just adding that very subtle shimmer to the background. Again, I don't need it to necessarily look like music. I just want to add some pattern to the background. And don't you just love the broken glass patterning that came from the plastic wrap? Makes for a very interesting background. Now again, because I want brown, because it's in my focal image, I'm going to use that script stamp and add it to the background. Just a little bit here and there. And I'm not too worried if it isn't perfectly stamped. This is just adding something to the background. There you can see the shimmer of the gold and how everything works together. Now I want to shade around. So I start using the Inktense blocks because I'm using the teal, and then I quickly decide to take the block and just make a line much like you would with the Stabilo All pencil, and then activate it. Way easier. And when you're using Inktense blocks, you've got so many colors to choose from. You're not limited to just black of the Stabilo All pencil. And it's permanent when it's dry. So if I add wet medium, like when I glue the napkin down, I'm not going to reactivate it. I decided to add a little bling to this one and make it a little different. I found this star stencil, Bright Star. It's a cake and cookie one from Crafter's Workshop, and I'm using Champagne Gold stencil butter. You can see I've put white paint or white gesso underneath where I'm going to glue the focal image, just like I did on the first one, and I'm gluing it down with my fluid matte medium, again, just like I did with the first one. I don't film all the steps if I've just repeated them. I also overpaint this as well, but I didn't film that. And then I'm stamping a different sentiment. All is calm, using my same wooden blocks. That one didn't quite go, so now I'm trying to match it. Whew. I use the heat tool and remove the tape after splattering with gold. And there we have it. One napkin, 2 cards, 2 watercolor techniques. Which background do you like more? I hope you give both of these watercolor techniques a try. Until next time, go get creative.